Queuing.
Yep. Sunday lunch. Oops, wrong day.
Saturday.
Saturday lunch.
Let's get a view of that chicken.
They can't talk when they're filming you. It's okay to do that. It's sort of funny when you're on camera, you don't ever think of what to say anymore.
See, there's Mike.
Can't find him?
Hi, Mike.
Hi.
Mike's busy eating flowers.
Eating flowers? See, some people will take a video camera and get a complete inventory in the house and video thing.
You've heard about it. Good for a move.
Yeah. And that videotape is ready. He's already one more to do it. And I did it for an aunt of mine. And she practically won it. It was her granddaughter. She practically won the takeoff. Watching the thing, I don't know why she watches it back in the That's she does, okay. Zoom in on that bee over there on the flowers. See that?
Okay.
Bee you can get of the bee.
Zoom in on those dirty socks at the picnic table.
There's a...
Can you find the bee?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's a bee hard at work on the cosmos.
This is a map of the Louisiana Purchase. At the turn of the century, in the early 1800s, the United States was only as big as that eastern section that you see. Part over here. And it was very, very important for Americans to be able to go to the port of New Orleans to sell their goods and to trade their goods overseas. It happened, though, that the port of New Orleans was controlled by the French. In fact, this entire territory that you see in wood was owned by the French. It just so happened at the time that the French were fighting a lot of Europeans. They were hard up for money. This was Napoleon. So Thomas Jefferson made a deal with them. He asked if he could purchase the city of New Orleans so that the Americans would have a port on the Gulf of New Mexico. As it turned out, Napoleon needed so much money that he offered Thomas Jefferson the entire French territory in the area of North America. And it was called Louisiana. So for one price, Thomas Jefferson purchased the city of New Orleans and the entire Louisiana territory from the French. It went from the Mississippi all the way west to the Continental Divide. It was mostly the drainage of the Missouri River. Thomas Jefferson did this without the consent of Congress. It was an illegal move. But with one purchase, Thomas Jefferson doubled the amount of land that the United States owned. And then he sent two people he knew, Lewis and Clark, west to explore. Now, the purpose of the exploration was to find a route to the Pacific Ocean, a commercial route to the Pacific Ocean for trade. So he sent Lewis and Clark westward in 1803, and that pretty well started the expansion of the West. And this museum that we're in right now explains how the West was settled, how the West expanded and was settled, beginning in 1803. What you see in front of you is a timeline of the 1800s. Every one of those panels explains each year in the 1800s, starting with 1800, 1801, 1802, and you can see the pictures of the presidents that were presiding over the country during those years. And there are quotes and pictures and interesting bits of information about what was going on during each year. What you see in front of you is some of the items that were used by Lewis and Clark in the early explorations of the West. And they're pretty good examples of other things that early explorers used to explore a lot of unknown territory out in the West. When Lewis and Clark returned from their explorations, they talked about all the things they had seen. And one of the big things they discussed were the amounts of fur-bearing animals out west, especially beaver. And when Lewis and Clark returned, that opened up the next stage of westward exploration, westward expansion, and that was the mountain men. All these people who headed west to trap beaver. Because of this, beaver became a popular style of hat. This particular style of hat made out of beaver fur and beaver felt. So they actually, when Lewis and Clark came back, they actually began this clothing rage, this beaver felt hat, and the demand for this hat caused more and more people to head west to search for the beaver. In fact, so many beaver were trapped that they were almost trapped to extinction. The only thing that stopped the beaver from becoming extinct in the West was the fact that the styles changed. Beaver hats went out of style, and because of that, the beavers were saved. This is a scene depicting the riverfront in St. Louis, early in the 1800s, about the 1830s. St. Louis was the jumping off point, the organizing point for a lot of people who headed west. They either left St. Louis by boat and headed up the Missouri River, or they left by wagon, or they left by foot or by horse. But St. Louis became a starting point for most of the people who headed west. There were literally thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people who headed west in the 1830s and the 1840s. They actually headed west because of this discovery of gold in California. They headed west for a variety of reasons, whether gold mining or ranching or farming. This is a photograph of the Oregon Trail up by Guernsey, Wyoming. You can see that so many people traveled through these sandstone areas that they actually ground grooves right through the rock. This is a wagon that's a pretty good example of the type of wagon that people would use in heading west. If you've ever heard of the word Conestoga wagon, maybe you've seen it in a lot of movies, it's a good falsity, it's an untruth about the West that we tend to hear from movies. This is not a Conestoga wagon. A Conestoga wagon was a heavy, very heavy freight wagon developed by the Germans in Pennsylvania for freight. These were not used out west. The typical wagon used out west was something like this called a prairie schooner. It was lightweight and designed to travel over the prairie efficiently. It was nicknamed Prairie Schooner because thousands of these wagons would be heading west across the prairies at one time. And when people would look out across the prairie and see these, they said they looked just like ships across the waves, because the grasses in the prairie were 3 or 4 or 5 feet high. You couldn't see the wheels, and all you saw was the canvas rippling in the wind. And they said they looked like sails on sailing vessels traveling across the water. As you can see, there isn't a whole lot of room in these wagons. These wagons were not like trailers we have nowadays. The people rarely slept in them. Maybe if there was a severe storm outside, they'd be sleeping in them. But these wagons were so full of goods, trying to move all your household possessions west, plus all the food and water and things that you would need for a journey west, even to repair your wagon if it broke down, because you have to remember that it took over 2 months to make the journey. The wagon bed was so full of equipment that there was no room for anybody to sleep. In fact, unlike you see in the movies, people did not ride in these wagons. If Mr. Jernigan shows a picture of the front of the wagon, you'll see that there is no seat. There's no buckboard to ride. People did not ride on these wagons. They were so full of gear there was not room for a seat, plus there wasn't enough. The wagons weren't built for so much weight. Your oxen or your horses had to travel a long distance, and if they also had to pull you sitting in the seats, it was just too much weight. Unlike they show in movies, if you were a child traveling this journey, you would be walking alongside. You would not be riding a horse. You would not be riding in the wagon. You would be walking alongside most of the entire journey. You can see that the wheels are extra wide. That was for better traction on the prairie lands and the mud and the sand and such on the journey west. You tended to bog down in the mud or the sand less, and the wider wheels made for easier pulling by the oxen or the horses. Usually, horses were never used. Mules were far better at pulling wagons than horses, and oxen were better than mules. Oxen had a long durability on the prairies and lasted quite a long time. As you can see on the view of the front of this wagon, there is no seat. The majority of people did not sit while riding west. They walked, including children. So you can forget about all those things you see in the movies. You might notice that there's a big white cloth covering the wagon. It was able to be drawn in at both ends to keep out the weather and the water and the wind and such. Most wagon cloths were not white. In fact, the wagons heading west were a variety of different types of cloth to keep out the weather, and a variety of different colors. In fact, it was quite colorful to see these wagon trains traveling west. And many people would write words on the side of the cloth pertaining to what it was they were doing, in Oregon or bust, or heading to the California gold fields or something like that. So actually the wagon trains were very colorful and very unique. Every wagon was different. One thing a lot of people don't remember was that a whole lot of people traveled west by boat. They went around South America or through the Isthmus of Nicaragua and headed to the gold fields of California by boat. And what you see here is a pilot's wheel from a paddle boat or a steamer on the ocean. These things were huge, as you can see by the kids walking in front. It was quite a tall wheel, but it's probably not what you think. Come on over to this picture and I'll show you. These wheels were quite large, but actually only half the wheel came up through the floor. The other half was below the floor level. As you can see in this picture, you can stand about here. You'd actually pull down or push back up on the wheel. But only half the wheel was coming up through the floor. You needed a big wheel because there was no power steering in those days. As you can see in this quote from Thomas Jefferson, in 1803 he gave these instructions to Captain Lewis. that the object of your mission is to explore the Missouri River and such principal stream of it as by its course in communication with the water of the Pacific Ocean may offer the most direct and practicable water communication across this continent for the purposes of commerce. So you see right away that this glorious trip by Lewis and Clark was actually an expedition set up by the United States to find a commercial water route to the Pacific Ocean. But Thomas Jefferson also knew that there was a great deal of exploring to do back out there, and that Lewis and Clark would be excellent people to do it. In fact, one was good at commanding a group of people, and the other one was very good at taking notes. And both of them were naturalists and ecologists and botanists, and they wrote down and drew pictures and looked at everything along the way, the people, the animals, the plants, everything. So it was quite an expedition from that point of view. If you look along this wall, you'll see some of the artifacts or examples of things that Lewis and Clark took with them on their journey. When you leave for a journey and you won't be back for 2 years, you can't take everything with you that you need. So you have to take people with you who are good at living off the land and providing for themselves along the way. Their trip took them through 2 winters. So it was a long trip. Here in the case are a number of things. 2 of them are quite interesting. I bet you can't guess what those brown things are all rolled up. They're called tobacco plugs. They were used for trade with the Indians. And you might see 2 great big round things that look like big coins or medals. Medals is what they were. Thomas Jefferson had those imprinted, and they were called friendship medals. And they were to be used in trade with the Indians that Lewis and Clark met along the way. They were symbols of friendship between the government and the native peoples out west. Here at the museum underneath the arch in St. Louis, we have a lot of animal displays, a number of animal displays of the animals that were very, very important to the exploration of the West. And this is the first one. These beaver were the reason why so many trappers headed west in the early 1800s after Lewis and Clark came back. They were very, very important to the economy of the West and of the United States. As we said before, they were used in the manufacture of beaver felt hats. The trappers out west had a distinct likability for these animals. You see, when you live off the land and you eat meat from animals who range free, not like cows and cattle that we feed with special feed, these animals that range free have pretty good meat, and it's very, very low in fat. And these trappers who lived out west had a fat deficiency. They never got enough fat in their diet, and they were craving fat in their diet, because we do need fat in our diet to survive. If you look at the tails of these beavers, the tail of the beaver is almost 100% fat. And if you were a trapper, this was a highly prized delicacy. The tails were great for eating. Here's another animal important to the exploration of the West. We'll film a park ranger giving a talk about the buffalo or the bison later. What we wanted to mention, though, that was these bison were not so important to the Americans, to the white man who headed west, as they were important to the native people who lived there. The only reason that the buffalo was so important to the white man was because he saw that if he could eliminate the Indians' source of food and equipment and life needs, then he could eliminate his problem with the Indians, and that's exactly what the white man tried to do. In fact, they did such a thorough job of annihilating and exterminating these animals that they were almost killed to extinction. Millions upon millions and millions of them were killed in just a few short years in the 1860s and 1870s.
This is a Plains Indian teepee. down at the skin of the buffalo. I have a little one in my hand here. It's a very small buffalo. It would be a baby buffalo. The kind of buffalo that you'll see later, a large buffalo, you need 15 of those on average to make a teepee about this size. And this one isn't quite as large as what the Native Americans would use, because this one couldn't be the same size as theirs because we have a ceiling here to work with in the museum, and they didn't have to worry about that. What they would do is they would sew the pieces of the buffalo together using a piece of the buffalo called the tendon, or the sinew, which is that piece of muscle, that piece of our body that holds our muscles to our bones. You can feel them if you reach in the back of your ankle. That's the easiest one to find. What they would do is they would waterproof the hide. After they'd taken all the hair off the hide, they'd then take some of the brain of the buffalo and some of the blood of the buffalo, mix it together, make a nice big goop, spread it all over this and spread it out in the sun for a couple days until it dries. That makes it nice and soft, and you can do all sorts of things with it. You can make clothes out of it, you can make a teepee out of it. It's nice and soft, and it wears pretty well. But your mother, if you were an Indian child, would have to be doing this work constantly, because a teepee like this only lasts a year or two if you're very lucky. And since you're packing up and moving very, very often following the buffalo, it got a lot of wear and tear and wore out. So if you think about moving 3 or 4 times a week, 10 or 12 times a month, packing up everything you own, that's a hard job. So that's why they didn't have a lot of things in the teepee, not a lot of belongings. You might have a favorite doll or a favorite game you would take with you, and that would be about it. Your dad would have his weapons and his horses, and your mom would have all her tools for working with the buffalo hides. And of course, she was responsible for the meat as well that you ate, which also came from the buffalo. You can see the teepee comes from the buffalo as well as a lot of other things that they had.
When the teepee was taken down, Andy, who was responsible for that?
Oh, that was the woman's job. The women would get together and they could have one of these down in about 5 minutes. They knew how to do it. Very good teamwork. They would pull the poles and it would come down, because you see the pins right here, that's what keeps it together. It wraps around the poles just like a paper snow cone holder. It's wrapped around, it's one piece. Pull those out, they unwrap it, they fold it up, they take the poles down and they put it on the travoy, which is a fancy name for a sled without runners. They could have it down in 5 minutes.
What did the kids do?
What did the kids do? Kids were responsible for all sorts of things, particularly collecting things called buffalo chips. There's another way of saying buffalo poop. Collected them, and they were very important because that's what they used for their charcoal, how they made fires, as well as other things. They had to learn what it was going to be like to be a grown-up Indian, learning different games that taught you lessons. A lot of your lessons were taught you by your grandmother and your grandfather, since your mother and father were busy with other things.
Thanks very much, Andy.
Hope that helped.
Just like the ranger said, this teepee is not full size. It's only about 3/4 full size. A full-size teepee would not fit in this museum because of the ceiling height, so they had to make it slightly smaller. Well, your teacher, Mr. Jernigan, is getting a special tour of what goes on down here underneath the arch. We have a museum of westward expansion, and in the back rooms, we have lockers filled with artifacts that we use with kids when they come for a field trip. We're going to walk over to this open locker. We'll show you some of the things associated with the buffalo and how the Indians used the buffalo to survive.
Come a little closer.
The buffalo was essential for the Indian survival. They used every part of it. They wasted no part. Can you tell what this is? It's a shoulder blade. What kind of uses or purposes do you think the Indians used this for? We've got a lot of other artifacts here. Even the bones of the buffalo were used. What could you use this for? It's pretty heavy, very solid. If you listen to that ranger talking about teepee life, then you'll recognize what these are. Buffalo chips. These were very, very important to Indian life, and the kids were the ones who collected them. See, if you live out in the plains, you don't have a whole lot of firewood for fires. And dried buffalo chips make better coals than wood does. Can you tell what these are, or what they were used for? Think about it. What would you use to string a bow if you're living off the land, if you're living off the animals? This is buffalo sinew. If you think about your Achilles tendon on the back of your ankle, that's what this is. It can be shredded, and it's very, very strong. Buffalo sinew was used for bows, for the string of bows. Probably recognize what these are. They'd have a variety of uses once you hollowed them out. How about this? Can you tell what that is? Does this help? If you were a Native American, what do you suppose you'd use this for? Can you tell what this is? It's part of the hoof of the buffalo. The inside part made a wonderful glue. In fact, for many years, we have made glue from the hooves of cattle and cows. Rib bones. What sort of uses do you think you might come up with if you were a Native American using these? Kids use them a lot in the snow. And you know this type of use. The hide of an animal, especially a buffalo, can be used for making clothing. I don't know if you can see this very well. This might give you a clue. Buffalo tongue. Tongue is still eaten in many parts of the world today. Have you ever felt a cat lick you? You know how rough a tongue can be. Well, it's a type of sandpaper. We're almost finished. These are pretty interesting. They're a type of bag, and they come from the inside of a buffalo, one of his organs. Now think about it. What organ would you have in your body that holds a lot of fluid? And that's what it is. It's a bladder. Bladders are waterproof and make great canteens. The ranger had previously showed you a deer hide, and this is an example of a full-size buffalo hide. When buffalo were hunted by the Indians, they were always hunted in the depths of winter. Why would that be? Why wouldn't you hunt a buffalo for its hide in the middle of summer? Because when you're hunting for a hide for warmth, it has the greatest amount of fur in the wintertime. Well, that's your special tour of the artifacts area here under the museum, at the museum under the arch. It's a place where most kids don't get to come. We'll show you 3 more things in the museum and then we'll be done. This is a bull boat, B-U-L-L, a bull boat. You know, a lot of Native Americans did come up with a way of traveling down a river in a boat. And again, they used all the natural materials that were available to them. This is a boat they designed. It was designed from one buffalo hide. And if you think about it, you're going to want a boat without any seams. So they came up with a design, a way to make a boat from one hide from a buffalo. And as you can see, they would treat the hide on the outside so that it was waterproof. And they would brace it with all the sticks on the inside, and it made a pretty good boat. You can see in the back they left the tail on. Sometimes that was just, it acted like a sea anchor and would keep the boat pointed in the right direction. Or sometimes it just told you where the back of the boat was. These boats were so light that when the Indians were finished using them traveling downstream, they would merely pick them up, flip them on their back, and walk back upstream. It was said that they often looked like beetles or ladybugs walking back up the river. This boat was strong enough for several men and even one horse. When people were expanding to the west, they also expanded into the southwest, which was owned by Mexico. It was Mexican territory. This was a type of cart that was used quite extensively in the southwest, the American southwest. It's called a carreta. As you can see, it's made of wood. It was a type of transportation designed by a group of people who did not have access to metal. Or if they did have access to metal, it would be very, very expensive. So they came up with a way to design a piece of transportation using no metal parts. And we'll show you a close-up of this in a moment. But this particular cart was extremely heavy, could carry a lot of load, and it was pulled by 2 oxen. Again, like we told you before, oxen were some of the most dependable animals to use on the trails. They lasted a long time and didn't need an extensive amount of grass like a horse or a mule or even cattle. So 2 oxen would pull this carreta. Think about this for a minute. How would you design a wheel without the use of metal parts? Take a look at the way this was made. This center part, into here, was carved out of the trunk of a tree. You can see how it comes down and out and down again, and it is all one piece. And then to make the wheel round, they added the 2 pieces on the outside and secured them with wooden pegs. You can see that the wheels aren't totally round, but it's good enough. It was said that you could hear these carts coming a mile away because you have wood rubbing on wood. Very often the people in the Southwest would take prickly pear cactus and stuff them in the axle to grease them up a little bit, but they were quite noisy. It was very good transportation, and it was appropriate technology for the place and the time. These carts were used for many, many, many years. They were very durable transportation.
Out in the Dakotas, Kansas, and Nebraska, the western part there, they don't have a tree for many miles, perhaps 100 or 200 miles with no tree at all. When they went to settle that country, there was no way that they could build a house in the normal manner. Because of this, they built a sod house. Now, in order to build a sod house, all you needed was a shovel. And you went out and you dug into the ground, made a square approximately 2 feet long and 1 foot wide, and perhaps 8 inches deep. And then you picked it up with your shovel, and you set it down, and you dug another one. You set on top of that. And if you were careful in doing it and allowed all the prairie grass on top to stay there so that the roots would go down in the mud and keep it from going apart, you would end up with a wall of your sod house. Sod houses were very successful where there was no wood. Naturally, when the time came that you had wood, you'd much rather have a wooden house than you would a sod one. Now notice in this case, we have started to build 3 walls, but we also know from looking at this, boys and girls, that it's after 1870 because these folks have a window. Now, of course, it's impossible that they could have built that window themselves because they have no wood. But after 1870, the railroads had come out to this area, and the mail order houses such as Susan Roebuck and Montgomery Ward sold windows. And after you had a little money ahead, you would order a window sent to the nearest railhead and put it in your sod house. Also, if you had the money, you'd probably buy a wooden door at the same time. And if you were really wealthy and living in a sod house, you would buy yourself a tin roof. This was especially important because, you see, the first big gully washer rain, if you didn't have a tin roof, if you had counted on the few logs that you could get and branches to put over it and then covered it over with earth, the first big rain would wash your roof in and you'd have to start all over again with your sod house. So when you could afford it, you ordered tin and put up a tin roof on your house. Now these are some typical objects that the average sod house would find. I don't mean the wooden floor, that's extra. Most sod houses would have earth floors, and of course constantly stepping on them, they'd be hard beaten down earth. But of course you'd need a trunk to store things in, you need a small cabinet, in this case one to put a pitcher on top of, and you would have to have some form of broom. Notice that they have made their own broom here out of straw, and they also have a type of mop that they made from corn shucks, actually. And I doubt if that would last very long as a mop. A few applications of a corn shuck mop, and you'd have to put new corn shucks in it. So it is better than nothing, certainly, but when the time came, I suspect Montgomery Ward or Susan Roebuck would get an order for a decent mop. Notice, boys and girls, that the light they had was an oil lamp. We call it oil, but it was probably coal oil by this time in the 1870s or 80s. And they would buy a gallon of coal oil at the nearest general store and probably take it home in a glass jug with a corn cob in the top as a stopper. And when night came, the only light they would have would be that one lamp.
St. Louis. They're in the south side. These homes were mostly built in the early 1800s. Shopping center out of it.
Off the picture, doesn't it? These are the grounds of the arch, the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial. We just got through with the big birthday here, 4th of July celebration with a few million people down here. This is the base of the arch. Between the outer skin and the inner skin is 3 feet of concrete, and that concrete is all the way up to the 300-foot level. At 300 feet the concrete stops and just holds up by its outside structure and inside structure. It's 630 feet high. Does sway a bit in the wind. Sways even better when the wind comes from the north or the south and twists a little bit.